Eileen Murphy consultants work across the UK as practitioners and trainers in solution-focused brief therapy and their own examine, repair and move on approach. The solution-focused brief therapy method was devised by Steve DeShazer in the 1970s, and is founded in the belief that little is to be achieved by focusing on tracing the pathology of problems, but that change can be achieved by focusing on solutions and moving forward.
It's about tomorrow. It's about how people are coping today, rather than tracing the pathology of the problem. And I just want to give you an idea of where it came from. Milton Erickson. Okay, I can't encourage you enough to read Milton Erickson. Anybody who works with challenging children, difficult clients, any complex situation at all, can benefit from reading Milton Erickson. So he was the foremost hypnotherapist in the world. He would take his clients through and get them to visualize themselves achieving their goals, making their change, overcoming trauma. Then Steve DeShazer came along in the 70s and said, look, why have we got to hypnotize? He studied under Erickson, but he said, why have we got to hypnotize people? Why can't we just have conversations for change? Why can't we talk about the future rather than hypnotizing people? And then he focused a great deal on exceptions, times when the problem isn't happening. Whenever someone's talking to you about a problem child, they don't say, oh, but wait, now that I've finished listing all the deficits, let me tell you about times when the child does achieve. Especially if that child is very, very difficult and challenging. Now, when the child comes in, discussing the problem yet again, I don't want to do that, because I know if that was going to work, that would have worked by now. When that child comes into the room, he expects the problem to be discussed. Yes? He knows the pattern. I say things and I talk in that little tune that people fall into. Sometimes at some point in your life, you'll open your mouth and your mother will come out of it. You know that. Equally, at some point in your life, you'll open your mouth and your teacher will come out of it. But what he's expecting is that kind of tune. Well, Adam, here we are again. That kind of thing. And he's going to switch off, and there's a pattern. And he knows very well how to disrupt the whole session and how to disrupt any kind of resource that's coming his way. So I want to disrupt the disruption. So when he comes in, instead of talking about the problem, I want to head him off at the pass, and you can see I'm breaking pattern because I say, I understand from Miss Johansson that last Tuesday, despite being provoked by the other boys and being under very difficult circumstances, you didn't kick off, you maintained discipline and stayed focused. Now, that could just be just one exception to an otherwise catalogue of bad behaviour. Now, everybody has the power to break a negative pattern by just doing something outside the box, by just doing what is not expected in the pattern. Can I give you an example? I hope it's to just the most dramatic example, I suppose. Can you imagine if you're a burglar? Even when you've got no resource, you've got a resource. Can you imagine Can you imagine if you're a burglar and you sneak into a house and all of a sudden at the top of the stairs this little old lady comes along? And say you're a bit of a geezer down the bottom of the stairs. Now, you know what's coming, don't you? You freeze for a second. Now, what does the old lady say when she looks down the stairs at you? The old lady says something like, what do you want? Yes? Or, get out or I'll call the police. Are you with me? Isn't that the pattern? And then that's the kind of, game is on. But just stay with me for a second. Can you imagine if you were that burglar down the foot of the stairs? The little old lady came along the landing and she spotted you. And if she did this to you, oh, come in. Herbert, we've got another one. Would you go up them stairs? Now, be honest. But that's what I'm saying about a resource. So the pattern that exists, all you have to do sometimes to change the situation is to do what's not expected. Now, I'm not saying that feelings aren't important, but feelings never changed anything. It's actions that change things. Would you agree? So I'm all for people talking about feelings. That's great, and I'll sit there for hours. But then I want to know when they're feeling better, when they're feeling more in control, when they're feeling back on track, what will they be doing? Because you see, John Ruskin tells us, doesn't he, that what you think, what you believe, what you know is of little consequence. The only consequence is in what you do. Would you agree with me? There's nothing else, is there? It's actions that change things. I do think we are all morally bound, ethically bound to always offer every disaffected, disempowered, or anybody going through any difficulty the opportunity to look at and talk about the day after change has been achieved, the day after the problem's been resolved, rather than only focusing on the day the problem began. And always to elicit strengths, and you only have to look at the Oklahoma City bombing, when the dogs, after finding so many dead bodies, refused to work. And they called Dr. Lawrence Meyer, the veterinary professor, to come and examine the dogs and said, look, they won't work. They've become depressed. So Dr. Meyer examined the dogs, and he said, look, they are depressed. Because they've been trained to find people. And all they're doing are finding dead bodies. They have no recent experience of success to build on. So what I suggest you do is you take the dogs off the site. You bring the volunteers on and get the volunteers to lie down in the rubble. Then you bring the dogs back on. The dogs will find people, and they'll be motivated to go on to find more people. Now, if it's that important to a couple of Alsatian dogs in Oklahoma, you can imagine how crucial it might be to the human gibbon for somebody to highlight one small success, and we can build on that.
You're not minimising the seriousness of the problem by talking about the exceptions.
No, not at all. And I do want to say, because it's very important to us, that the problem is never minimised. Minimising the problem is not allowing any discussion about it. And that's not true at all. They can discuss the problem and feel free to talk about their difficulty for as long as they want. But the exception, it's right that we're curious about the exception to the difficulty, because the client will never be. The client will never stop themselves in the middle of a problem and say, well, wait, let me think about times when I don't do this. The client doesn't do that, so somebody has to do it. Nobody does depression, for instance, 24/7. Nobody does alcohol or drugs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Nobody loses their temper every time they're angry. There is always an exception, and it's by being curious about that exception and discussing it and asking questions about it.